Mayken Karlzon's Diary Chapter 7. How They Kept the Faith in Holland. May 1, 1566. It is just a year since I began to write down some of the things I most wanted to remember, and now so much is happening in Holland and even in our own city of Antwerp, that I am not sure that I shall have room for any more of dear mother's stories of sunny Spain. I am sure the home of her girlhood must have been a happy one, for when she tells me of the old garden in which she and her sisters used to play, her voice is always low and tender, and once or twice I have seen tears in her eyes, and yet she was glad to quit the land of her birth. She has often told me how, on the night of her escape, with father leading her mule in the silence and darkness of night, they crossed the frontier, leaving Spain by a narrow and dangerous mountain pass, neither daring to speak even a whispered word to the other. For a band of the Pope's soldiers, who had been sent to guard that very pass, were so near that they could hear their voices, but as they were playing cards, and were too much absorbed in their game to notice the almost noiseless tread of the mule, by the good hand of God my father and mother got through safely. I am 13 now, so I understand better than I did a year ago why my father looks so grave at times, and why the voices of many of our friends often sound so full of trouble. The outlook is certainly not a bright one. King Philip is more determined than ever to burn all the heretics in his dominions, though the people he calls heretics are only those who wish to read the Bible and obey its teachings. We hear, too, that some of his subjects have grown restless and impatient, and think of taking up arms against the king, but our good Burgomaster van der Werf, my father, and a few others are doing all they can to persuade them to trust in God and wait patiently, so I hope and pray that they may see that such advice is wise and good, and be content to follow it. All the time father can spare from his business correspondence, which takes up the greater part of each working day, has been devoted lately to writing letters of cheer or sympathy to friends far and near who are suffering, or may at any moment be called upon to suffer, for the truth, or seeing people who come to him for advice or help, so that he is very seldom able to take me for a walk, but yesterday was a public holiday, owing to the opening of a new bridge across the Scheldt, and I went with him to see the procession. It was a pretty sight. Our burgomaster and councillors looked quite grand in their robes of office. The city guilds carried large, gaily painted banners, as well as symbols of their various trades or industries. Colors were flying from the windows and roofs of many of the houses, a band of musicians played lively national airs, friends and neighbors were greeting each other, and yet I could not help noticing that almost every face wore a troubled or anxious look. I felt I must ask father to tell me why there should be so much sadness, and I had not long to wait for an opportunity, for as we were returning home by the quay we saw some fine ships in full sailing making for our harbor. Father stood silently gazing at them for a few moments, then, turning to me, said sadly, "Those ships are sailing the wrong way, Mayken." "The wrong way, father?" I exclaimed in surprise. "What can you mean?" "They are laden with Flemish silks and woolen cloths, the work of Dutch weavers, who sought refuge in England from the persecution that has been going on ever since the Inquisition came to Holland. 10 years ago they would have sailed from Dutch seaports, many of them from Antwerp, so bringing trade and wealth to our shores. Now they sail from English ports, and I believe the blessing of the Lord will rest upon the country that gave them a welcome and a home. The towns of Sandwich and Norwich, where so many of our countrymen have settled, are, I hear from frequent letters, prosperous and peaceful. Our brethren have not only been encouraged to set up their looms, but some are employed in teaching English workmen the art of our woolen manufacture. Many of my best workmen have already left me, others are, I know, more or less secretly, preparing to follow. I cannot forbid their doing so, I would not if I could, and yet their leaving will render me unable to fulfill my contracts, and the factory, in which only a few years ago so many weavers were earning good wages, will have to be closed from want of hands to work its looms." "Is the Bible a forbidden book in England?" I asked half timidly, for I felt at that moment as if a great tide of hope and joy that I could not put into words was sweeping over me. "No, Mayken," he replied. "Our brethren not only read it in broad daylight, none daring to make them afraid, but are allowed to meet together to worship God in the way in which they believe the Bible teaches. They also openly instruct their children in the Scriptures and the doctrines of the Reformed faith. While the laws that have been framed to prevent any of the inhabitants of the Netherlands from leaving the country are very severe, punishing with fines and imprisonment any who are found attempting to leave the country, the captains of ships and masters of sailing vessels being also forbidden to allow them to take passage, it is a cause of constant surprise and rejoicing that so many of our brethren and sisters in the faith have been thus far preserved and watched over. God has prospered them, and more than once they have sent money to be distributed among families that have been plunged into poverty and distress by the husband and father having been found guilty of possessing a New Testament, or of teaching his children other than Latin prayers, and been thrown into one of King Philip's prisons. Why then, Father, cannot we escape to England? I found courage to say. You and I and Mother, and Paul and his father, and Trycon, good, faithful Trycon. We could not leave her behind, for though she calls herself a Catholic, and says what was good enough for her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother it is good enough for her, I am sure she loves God, and one day when Mother was speaking to her of the Saviour's sufferings, I saw tears running down her face, and after, as she went about her work, I heard her say, as if talking to herself, for me, for me. Oh, if it was really for me, how wonderful! But it is almost too good to be true. Besides, it would almost break her heart if we were to leave her. Oh, do please take Trycon. Father drew me a little way from the quay, and after looking round to be sure that we were alone, said, Your question, Mayken, is one that I have often asked myself, and even talked over with your mother. Why do not I with those near and dear to me seek, as so many of my countrymen have done, for some way of escape from the despotic rule of the King of Spain? For many weeks and even months I was uncertain what I ought to do. I took my difficulty to God in prayer, asking for light and guidance. At last, I believe I saw clearly that while there seemed some good reasons for going, by remaining I should be doing the will of God. You know that your Aunt Ursula and myself visit the prisons whenever we are allowed to do so. Among those undergoing punishment for various offenses are several who have been arrested on suspicion of leaning toward the Reformed faith, or on the charge of having absented themselves from the Mass, but as no orders have been received concerning them they are still awaiting trial. At any moment they may be removed to the dungeons of the Inquisition, or even led forth to die as martyrs, but while they remain in the common prison, we are able now and then to visit them, speak words of encouragement, and do what we can, by supplying them with food and clothing, to make their situation a little more comfortable. And what a joy it will be if one day the Lord should say of such little service, Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Matthew 25 verse 40. Then, too, if I quit my post, the factory must close at once, and some of my workmen, who for family reasons cannot leave the country, would be plunged into the deepest distress. Peter von Roth has not only a sick wife, but is the sole support of his aged and almost blind mother. Trade is so bad, not only in Antwerp, but all over Holland, that it would, I am afraid, be difficult for them to find employment elsewhere. So for their sakes I am willing to remain, and if needs be endure hardness, as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. 2 Timothy 2 verse 3. I will give you just one more reason why I should remain where I am. I, with many others, believe that God is about to raise up a leader who will deliver the Netherlands from the yoke of Spain. It may, and perhaps will, be William, Prince of Orange. Many who would have stood by him in the coming struggle for truth and freedom have already left the country, and he must not find, when he comes, that all have gone. No, my Mayken, we will be still, and quietly trust in God.